Hello, my name is Tosca Bruno van Vijveken and I direct the Transnational NGO Initiative here at the Maxwell School. We regularly invite visitors, and today I have Mr. Alp Aslandogan. He is the Executive Director of the Alliance for Shared Values, which is one of the NGOs here in the US representing the Hizmet or Gulen movement in the US. So, Mr. Aslandogan, thank you so much for having this interview today, and I look forward to your talk later today. So, we invited you because the Hizmet or Gulen movement is an example of a globally operating faith-based movement. Tell us a little bit more, for those who don't know, about the Hizmet or Gulen movement. What is the nature of the movement? What is the mission?
It is a social movement which seeks to combine personal spiritual growth with social action. So it is based on the premise that spiritually everyone can do better, can grow our potentials and realize our potentials, but that is not enough, that we have to put that in action in improving our societies. So starting in the late 60s, early 70s, several hundred NGOs today have been formed, and it is estimated that millions of people participate in this transnational movement.
I see. And so you are, if I understand it right, an Islamic faith-based movement. How do you situate the Hizmet movement in the global ecosystem, if you will, of Islamic faith-based organizations?
In terms of its founders and the vast majority of its participants, they are Muslims, but it is not a religious movement. It is open to all. Its basic premise is that there are certain high human values where people of different backgrounds can gather. Therefore, it was established by Muslims, but it is open to all.
I see, and it sounds it's more like a faith-inspired movement than faith-based in an institutional sense.
Exactly.
Right. So we're always interested in you also as a person. So tell us how did you get involved in the Hizmet movement, and how did you become a leader?
My first encounter was actually through a publication. Where Mr. Gülen, who is the inspirational founder of the movement, helped publish. It was a scientific magazine which gave the perspective of a faithful citizen on science. Later on, I met with his students. I got involved in some interest groups, like a writers group. I was very interested in writing, translating. I was writing articles for a science magazine in Turkey. Later on, I got involved with other NGOs and served on their boards. And all this time I was serving on a volunteer capacity, and within the last 3 years I actually accepted an offer to serve in a professional capacity.
In the last 3 years, yes. I see. And that's very interesting how that came about. And for a moment I'm drawing an analogy with academics here in the US who are proclaimed Christians and who are reconciling that with being involved in science. So tell us a little bit about, when you think about currently about 2 or 3 of the challenges that the Hizmet movement is facing, what are some of those and how are you tackling these as movement organizations?
Yes. Well, one challenge actually relates to its transnational growth. The movement started in Turkey and remained in Turkey for a few decades. Around 1980s, the late 1980s, during the era of Prime Minister and President Özal, Turkey opened up globally. And with this, movement participants also had a chance to visit and move to other countries. And starting in the Central Asian countries, the movement became increasingly transnational. So this transnational growth brought questions and challenges with it, because predominantly the original founders and participants were Turkish Muslims. And first, they encountered with Muslims of non-Turkish origin, and in other countries they encountered people of non-Muslim origin. So it was their basic premise of bringing people of different backgrounds around values was tested, and still being tested. So how open is the movement to leadership by non-Turks, non-Muslims is an ongoing challenge. Another challenge has to do with the current situation in Turkey. Turkey's political leaders have actually chosen to scapegoat the movement and Mr. Gülen for the political troubles. So the movement is facing a substantial challenge there. I think another challenge is the generational difference. Now, today, we're talking about over 1 million participants. So this movement, which started with a few people, now reached over 1 million people. Of course, there are at least 3 generations. So the generational gap in terms of how they look at the concept of social movement, NGOs, their leadership and governance and everything, there are certain tensions there.
Very interesting. And also, I appreciate the candidness with which you are responding to that question. So, when the Hizmet movement thinks about effectiveness, what does effectiveness mean for you as a movement? How do you define it, and when do you know that you're effective?
In my view, the first criterion would be, are you true to your original values and your original mission? Of course, these are not necessarily easy to measure, but the people ultimately are the decider on whether the organizations or the groups stay true to their original mission. So this, the checks and balances that are provided by volunteers and the fundraisers and the donors is always there and will always be there. But increasingly, other measures of effectiveness are being adopted by NGOs and by individuals. These include field-based or sector-based accountability measures, certain standards, certain international standards, and the mindset of the people who serve in these NGOs is changing to embrace these more objective, more international standards and make that part of their understanding of their effectiveness.
I'm going to put this a bit in black and white terms, but doesn't that kind of shift trend towards professionalization, if I can summarize it in that way for a moment? Is there any tension between that shift towards professionalization and the intrinsic movement character of the movement?
There's always a tension between strict professionalization and the volunteer dedication nature of the movement. And people have to manage this tension and this balance all the time. Sometimes either Mr. Gülen or other influential writers and speakers will speak to these topics, publications will come out, institutional reviews will come out, and they will self-evaluate with regard to these issues. But this is the topic I know in the discussions of the boards of directors and among the volunteers and the donors of the institutions.
Very interesting. I'll be looking forward this afternoon in your talk, for instance, to the whole question of how does a movement like the Hizmet movement relate to development NGOs or relief NGOs, etc. But we'll leave that for the talk. So let me then finally turn to a question around career advice that you would like to give our students when they look at playing a role like you're playing in one of the NGOs here in the US that represents this global movement. Maybe first the question is, how does a day for you look like, or a day on the job for you look like? What kinds of things do you do in your job on a daily basis?
Well, our function as an umbrella organization for 6 other organizations is to help them do a better job in their mission. So we provide resources to these organizations, to their leaders. We arrange for their regular meetings so that they can share best practices. They can discuss their plans for the future, for the coming year, their annual plans. We give recommendations to them. We evaluate their plans, their institutional documents. We also sometimes help them get together their resources so that they can achieve things that they cannot do individually. So that's our umbrella function. We also have another function where we become an intermediary between the media and the think tanks and the movement in the United States. So in a sense, we become a face for the movement, for those interested in studying the movement.
Yeah. But what does it mean for what you do as an individual leader?
For me, my current work involves a lot of communication, a lot of research, and maybe I can jump directly to your career advice. Go
ahead.
What I found most valuable in my years, first as a professor and then a board director, also a leader of an education institution, and now the leader of this institution, is I find people skills, communication skills are the most crucial in almost every aspect of my life. So I would definitely urge young potential leaders to invest in those 2 categories. I cannot imagine any job where you can do something just by yourself. So people skills is absolutely critical in the success of any organization that you will serve in. And communication skills is important because it is absolutely necessary for moving people, but it is also important for preventing obstacles and problems. So maybe that aspect actually might be more important. And I regret that some of these crucial skills are not actually taught in many institutions.
I was going to ask you, what can our students here at the Maxwell School, which is a public management and citizenship school, what can they do in terms of coursework that helps them with those skills?
Yeah, I would definitely recommend a basic course in psychology, basic communication principles. I would recommend developing skills of self-evaluation, any courses that help evaluate yourself and determine the psychological foundations of the behavior and to both instill permanent change in yourself and also observe patterns among others and be a positive force factor in changing organizational behavior.
Yeah, it's really interesting because in our work in the TNGO initiative on leadership development and in our leadership trainings, we put a lot of emphasis first on self-knowledge and self-reflection. We've done probably about 30 interviews in the last 4 or 5 years, and you're the first leader to mention this aspect of psychology, understanding self and understanding others. I find that really striking. So I want to thank you very much for your interview today, and I look forward to your talk.
Thank you.